Right now I'm thinking about those things that I know, but the daylight will soon be breaking, breaking.
RNZ National, we've learnt not to get too excited about a new Neil Young album because you never quite know what you're going to get. But as fans, to hear that he was releasing an album that was originally recorded in 1974 was pretty special. Someone who knows more about his discography than me got in touch to suggest it was probably recorded in between On the Beach and Zuma, if that means anything to you. And the album is called Homegrown, and it's available as of today. Neil Young's described it as the one that got away, and he says it was an album written in heartache, and heartache is a topic that he's pretty good at writing on. So pleased to play that song for you today. That one's called White Line. Coming up to the 2 p.m. news, and Paul Brennan, our newsreader, will be crossing live to Megan Woods and Commodore Darren Webb when that media conference starts, which is due around now. So that may come partway through the bulletin. After 2 o'clock, we continue with our New Zealand Live look at the best covers performed in studio here. We've got Fake Plastic Trees, performed by local musician Jasper Hawkins, and also listen out for Ardejar, who are doing a Paul McCartney song every night, and of course Nadia Reid, Fade Into You. That's all coming up after 2 p.m.
Thank you. Well, kia ora koutou, and thank you everyone for being here. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge today's events in which a police officer has been fatally shot. This is heartbreaking for the officer's family, friends and workmates, and we send our condolences to them. But today, I'd like to introduce you all to Air Commodore Darren Webb, who you know has been appointed to oversee the operations of all quarantine and managed isolation facilities by the Prime Minister this week. Darren has previously been in charge of the coordination of repatriation flights, and as such has a good understanding of the huge logistical challenge of repatriating hundreds of New Zealanders every day in the middle of a global COVID-19 pandemic. His new role is Head of Managed Isolation and Quarantine and will be in charge of all isolation and quarantine facilities. This means oversight of all processes within those facilities, including the provision of testing, enforcement of rules, logistical supply chains such as PPE, coordination of relevant agencies, standing up of new facilities, and continued oversight of repatriation flights. He also has accountability for those people who are in charge of each facility. And Darren will shortly detail what actions we have taken in the last few days and what actions we will be undertaking in the next 72 hours to tackle the problems that have emerged in the last few days. I'm here today because in the last weeks the government has been working on a plan to transition the emergency response to COVID-19 to a tightly managed longer-term response. From 1 October, the overarching lead and coordination of responsibility for managed isolation and quarantine will shift to the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Megan Main, the Deputy Chief Executive from MB, will be leading this work stream. MB is a key government agency that has the scale and scope to deal with complex issues and work across other government agencies. The Prime Minister has delegated responsibility for overseeing the managed isolation and quarantine facilities to me. This includes both the current operation of the current facilities and the development of a transition plan, which will be led between the All of Government Group and MB in a work stream that will be taking place with Carolyn Tremaine and Mike Bush. As Housing Minister, I already have responsibility for the temporary accommodation service as part of the COVID response, and I have existing portfolios within MB. While our team of 5 million has achieved something very few other countries in the world have achieved in getting to level 1 with no community transmission, the reality is that we're living in a world where we've seen over 8 million confirmed cases and over 440,000 deaths. There are currently 3.6 million active cases of COVID around the globe. It is clear that the virus will be circulating in the world for some time to come. And it is also clear that New Zealand will continue to see cases. There are 100,000 cases being identified every day around the world. And it is obvious to anyone that as New Zealanders who have a right to come home into the country, some will be carrying the virus. But it is our job to protect New Zealanders. We must prepare for that and to ensure that our processes at the borders, managed isolation and quarantine facilities are robust. This week, we have seen that has not always been the case. There have been problems with the implementation of the testing regime. It did not meet our expectations, and it did not meet the expectations of New Zealanders. There have been issues with the rigour around approvals relating to testing, as well as numerous allegations of those in managed isolation mixing together. This is unacceptable, and we have acted with urgency to fix the problems that we have seen emerge. We fully accept that the expectations that we all had about how the managed isolation processes worked have not been working, and we have been taking action. The facilities that were fit for purpose in the immediate emergency phase are no longer what we need. We need to move the operation of facilities to having a single point of accountability and responsibility, and that person is Darren. You will have heard today about the plan to ensure that COVID-19 tests that should have been carried out are being carried out. 700 tests have been completed today, and there is capacity to complete all day 3 and day 12 tests. The failure in the testing regime is being addressed, and Darren's role includes oversight of the facility's processes and ensuring that testing people that are meant to have been tested are carried out. We must be vigilant in preserving the status we have got to as one of only a handful of countries amongst hundreds to the point we have with zero community transmission. Our focus must be on ensuring the virus's entry back onto our shores is fully contained. And that is why we have moved to ensure our managed isolation and quarantine procedures are solid. There are 4 facilities, these are level 4 facilities operating in a level 1 world. And we as a government have a responsibility to ensure that these facilities are managed in such a way that any potential spread of the virus is stopped in those facilities. But the people staying in those facilities also have an obligation and responsibilities to all of us. Every single person who wants to rejoin the team of 5 million has a role to play. Just as we all earned our shift back to level 1, we earned it by staying at home for 5 weeks. We stayed away from our extended families, people cancelled weddings, birthday parties didn't happen, and most tragically, people could not be with their loved ones in their final hours or grieve together. We did this to protect each other from the deadliest and most rampant disease we have seen in decades. We earned it by preparing our health system and our communities for the very real possibility that COVID could cause a wave of devastation that other countries have seen and are dealing with. The fact that it didn't happen is owed to our collective hard work. But let me be very clear, we cannot guarantee the behaviour of every individual in managed facilities or the quarantine facilities. This is a cross-section of New Zealand society. There are always people who will look to break the rules. But what I will guarantee is that we will have robust systems in place and there will be consequences for people who break those rules. We cannot give up our privileged position of having some of the most liberal settings and open economies in the middle of a global pandemic without a fight. Just as we were in level 4 for nearly 5 weeks, anyone coming onto our shores needs to adopt the same behaviours. While all people coming into our managed isolation and quarantine facilities are given information about hygiene and social distancing and are checked daily by medical staff, it is being made crystal clear to them what our expectations are of them. Just as the Prime Minister reiterated many times to all of us through levels 3 and 4, incoming people should act like they have COVID-19. And they should have regard to all the other people who have travelled in from overseas as if they have COVID. Because there is a very real possibility that some will do. They owe it to all of us who did the hard mahi through those weeks of level 3 and level 4. We need to absolutely guarantee to the nth degree that people joining our communities and rejoining our team of 5 million do not have COVID. And that's what their isolation period is all about. That is what testing can tell us, and that's why it's so important to get the assurance that testing gives us and to make sure we get it right. And we are determined to make this work because the alternative is unthinkable. Earlier this week, I joined Darren for a visit to 2 managed isolation and quarantine facilities in Auckland. We spoke to staff on the ground, observed their management systems for processing people through accommodation, and were shown around the facilities. We saw people who are among the team of hundreds who are working incredibly hard to manage a very complex operation while also looking after the health and well-being needs of thousands of people every day. I'm now going to hand over to Darren, who will outline the actions that we are and have been undertaking. Thanks, Darren.
Thank you, Minister, and can also start by offering my sympathies to the New Zealand Police Force today. Firstly, I'd like to thank the staff on the ground and the amazing work that's been put in. Recent events have put their work into the spotlight, but it must be said that over 19,000 returnees have been through managed isolation. Our staff in these facilities have done a fantastic job to ensure the majority of these have been completed safely and returned back to their loved ones and friends. These staff have stood at the front line of New Zealand's main defence against COVID-19, and in the majority have been successful in keeping COVID-19 from entering our communities. However, as recent events have shown, we have not been 100% successful in our management of our isolation facilities, and there have been a number of situations that have highlighted this. As mentioned by the Minister and announced by the Prime Minister earlier in the week, I've been appointed as the Head of Managed Isolation and Quarantine. This means oversight of all processes within the facilities, including the provision of testing, enforcement of rules, logistical supply chains such as PPE, coordination of relevant agencies, standing up of new facilities, and continued oversight of repatriation flights. I also have accountability for those people who are in charge of each facility. In my new role, I have today commissioned an end-to-end review into the managed isolation and quarantine process from once they've been granted entry into New Zealand to departure after 14 days following the necessary exit protocols and have been assessed as low risk. Leading this review is Commodore Tony Miller from the Royal New Zealand Navy. He is being supported by Andy Milne, Deputy National Commissioner at the Department of Corrections, and Senior Sergeant Catherine Gibson from the New Zealand Police. The review team will be looking at end-to-end induction processes, general security and the safety of travellers, provision of health services, and standardisation of procedures including COVID testing and screening. This review will be completed over the coming days, and a final report will be presented to me next week. There is no doubt that this is a complex matter, but it is also the most important part of our collective defence against COVID-19 while we remain in a global pandemic. I understand that every New Zealander will be concerned by what has eventuated and will want to know as soon as possible that our processes and procedures are adequate. I am committed to ensuring we understand what has happened. As the Minister mentioned, we travelled together to Auckland on Wednesday for a site visit at one of the managed isolation facilities and a quarantine facility. Following on from this visit, and as the Minister has spoken to, we already have an understanding of what some of the issues are and have already taken action. The matter of staff and resources is something that I've taken immediate action on. Yesterday I received approval from the Chief of Defence Force for the deployment of additional personnel from the New Zealand Defence Force to double their on-site presence. This will increase defence personnel from 36 to 72 staff, with a number of these people having already arrived at these facilities today. Police's on-site presence will also be increasing, with additional staff in each facility and specifically identified after-hour support should it be required. These personnel will assist local staff in a number of roles, including ensuring the security and safety of returnees during their time in managed isolation. We know from what we are hearing from these hotels is that there's been issues with people coming into contact with others who have arrived prior to them, sometimes including those who have just arrived and those who are about to leave. I want to be clear, this is not acceptable. And these additional personnel will assist us in ensuring that this does not occur. As the Minister has said, we will have robust systems in place and strong accountability at both the national level through my role and at each of the facilities through a designated on-site operational lead. The Minister and I spoke with these leads earlier today to emphasise the criticality of their role. This includes my expectations and the rigour required in managing the exit process to ensure COVID does not enter our communities through the border. And I'll be following up with a letter to each of these leads on this. Nonetheless, returnees are left in no doubt that individual accountability sits at the core of our collective COVID fight. People must be responsible for their own actions. We didn't require a police officer or someone in an NZDF uniform to be on every street corner during the lockdown period, and each New Zealander played their part. We're asking the same of returnees during their stay in managed isolation and quarantine to take responsibility for their own actions and ensure they abide by our rules during their stay. I must be clear, people must take responsibility for their actions, and if they choose not to, there are consequences, which may include a $4,000 fine or 6 months in prison. Also, following the private event that was held at the Pullman Hotel, I have asked for a review of current arrangements with facilities to ensure that this does not happen again. I have determined that any facility being used for managed isolation is not used for private functions. This morning the Minister and I spoke with the Director General of Health on the matter of testing in facilities. He has advised that on Tuesday he has ramped up the testing at facilities for those at day 3 and day 12 of their stay. He has also prioritised the testing for those in the final days of their stay, with 927 returnees due to leave managed isolation over this weekend. Of those 927, we're expecting 247 to leave today, 450 tomorrow and 230 on Sunday. As the Director General mentioned earlier today, over 6,000 tests were completed, including those required for returnees coming to the end of their stay. It will be a requirement of each of these returnees that they are considered low risk by the Ministry of Health, which includes the return of a negative test before they can leave. As evident from some who have already left facilities, this has not always occurred. I've made it clear to my staff on the ground that until they've received confirmation of the negative test result, no one is to leave. Finally, I want to address some of the matters that have been raised in the media over the last 24 hours in regards to my own involvement in managed isolation and quarantine to date. Up until the Prime Minister appointed me responsible for the end-to-end process of managed isolation and quarantine, including the provision of services for returnees, I had a role in leading a number of different parts of the overall system. This included the facilitation of over 19,000 arrivals from the airports to facilities, managing logistics support including security and safety, managing the walks and outdoor exercise at each facility, and the repatriation of over 62,000 foreign nationals out of New Zealand, such as their domestic travel to major hubs and their departure from New Zealand. I did not have responsibility for the provision of testing in facilities, any exemption applications and the approval process, the provision of health services, or any follow-up self-isolation plans or the assurance of those plans. As I said earlier, my new role now includes oversight of all processes within the facilities, including the provision of testing, enforcement of rules, logistics supply chains such as PPE, coordination of relevant agencies, standing up of new facilities, and continued oversight of repatriation flights. I also have accountability for those people who are in charge of each facility. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, and we're happy to take any questions.
Minister, on your new role, is that an acknowledgement that there wasn't adequate oversight of quarantines by the Health Minister?
What the new role about is actually the transition to the longer term arrangements that we'll have that will sit within MB. So it is actually about the time it is we move from the temporary emergency response to the long-term home for it, which will sit within an MB. It's analogous to what responsibility I took as a Minister of Housing for the TAS function that sat within MB, and I already hold 2 portfolios that sit within MB, so it seemed a reasonable, logical choice. I'll be working very closely with the Minister of Health because there are some statutory health functions that sit there, but in terms of the accountabilities and responsibility for the operations that sits at the moment with Darren, and in terms of ministerial responsibility that sits with me.
Air Commodore, you said you were responsible before in your previous role for walks and exercise. We've heard of examples where people who are COVID-19 positive were mingling on their exercise in the car park at Jet Park Hotel with people who were potentially not COVID positive. So have you overseen breaches as well in your previous role?
I think it's fair to say that some of the systems in place haven't worked as well as we'd hoped, and one of my roles now is to make sure that we really bolster those processes and procedures, and continue to learn from those opportunities so that every New Zealander can feel safe.
A lot has been made about the complexities of this operation. To a layman, it wouldn't seem that complex. If somebody comes into a quarantine centre and leaves with 2 tests, why is it so complex?
Barry, to give you an idea of the complexity of this situation, so to date 20,151 people have been through a quarantine or managed facility. This has required 626 staff on the ground. This isn't just checking into a hotel and getting a test on the way in and on the way out. That there has been $81 million that will be spent to the 30th of June. It requires not only the accommodation, it requires the food, the wraparound services, the logistics, the health services such as testing and security. One of the things that I was struck by when we visited the facilities earlier in the week was the high resourcing required to make one of these facilities work, and it's why we need to proceed with such caution and make sure we're matching capacity with our ability to receive people coming into the country. So it is a very complex operation.
Can you just clarify, with the October 1st, is that when MB takes over this role? Can you just clarify why you're in charge now if MB doesn't kick in until the 1st of October?
Because we'll be putting in place a transition plan. What we need to do is start moving that work through to MB. We expect that process to be complete by 1 October. But this is very much moving away from being a health response and the operations lying with health, with the operations shifting earlier within MB. So we're starting that shift as part of the transition plan.
Transition earlier because of the botch-ups